mentioned. And in the following talk, I would like to then detail a more specific characterization of Uranian psychoanalysis today as a homosexual realizational tool of bejeweling initiatory possibilities. I would like to describe for you how an appreciation of Uranian psychoanalysis developed in me personally. A story which leads up to establishment of the Institute, as well as continues to this day. As you can imagine, I was not at first inclined to be psychologically minded at all, of course, since I was a dutiful product of my out-of-it family, culture, and time, as much as anybody else. Having been born in early 1951, nearby here, down in Culver City, by the way, Culver City, over there, maybe. Down in Culver City, by the way, I was a true child of that famously conformist decade and grew up in an oblivious world, pretty much through successfully formatting a fairly oblivious attitude. Although I had always particularly loved experiences of the wonderful and magical, or numinous, as you might say, which I encountered in the presence of animals and plants, dreams and fantasies, bright colors, movies, television, books, Disneyland. There is no telling if that might have been of sufficient interest in general to spark my later Jungian direction, because starting when I was around 11 years old, I began to increasingly notice a particularly disquieting, sort of marvelously intriguing reaction I was appetizingly feeling in the presence of certain male people. A peculiarly warm upsurge that had actually been aromatically stirring for some years, but which I had hitherto shied away from self-recognitionally specifying. An insurgent, sensual upsweep that became growingly so suffused with a lush intimational numinosity, excitingly way beyond that of my love for animals or crystals. A most savory, kinetic feature, provocatively highlighting a growing suspicion in myself, which would fatefully come to dominate my inner ruminations and my actual future as a person, a professional, and an activist. I did my best to keep warding off the doubts I felt looming darkly in my young self-consciousness, as I not so dissociatedly enjoyed the new genital sensations and imaginal beyond I was starting to pleasurably experience, in spite of whatever shame, horror, or other malevolent reactions might have been lurking thereabouts. But by the time I turned 13, I had grudgingly come to vaguely sense that the accumulating evidence was unfortunately incontrovertible. I was experiencing a robust early homosexual adolescence in a repressive social world that despised and vilified such a focused amatory interest violently and viciously. Finally, this bothersome self-suspicion then blossomed into clearer recognition through an oddly singular and unanticipated incident of great force, as I continued clinging to what shreds of denial and dissociation I could in the face of my own intuition that a pivotal watershed was quickly approaching. One day, while I was walking to lunch in this foreboding mood with the rest of my 7th grade class across a street that divided our part of the school campus from the cafeteria, a vivid sensation of clouds parting came over me. And looking up, I heard from above a powerful, unfamiliar male voice boom out deeply in a measured cadence that emphatically and carefully spoke each word, "You are a homosexual." It was not necessarily a judgmental or evaluative voice, but rather a factual one, yet with a personal sense of great profundity and implicated fate which, although quite immaterial and invisible in any literal sense, as I could see by looking around me at the unconcerned faces of my classmates, nonetheless had sharply jolted me, like no single event I had ever encountered before, qualitatively more like something I could picture happening to characters in a fantasy novel, or Cecil B. DeMille's 1956 religious movie, The Ten Commandments. not addressed specifically to me, in a penetrating magical way, such as I had never imagined could be individually actually available. Needless to say, as they might have said back then, I felt all shook up pretty badly after that. I could hardly eat my lunch in the cafeteria that day, for trying to better absorb what the voice had revealed, and how I was then going to live a future life which was not to be privately only of hellish failure and pain, no matter its outward appearance. Naturally, I then blamed myself for this twisted condition, and I fell into a depressed state of deep mortification and toxic shame. What was I now to do? Undoubtedly, this sticky quandary was not coincidentally unfolding during a period in my life when I was preparing for my Orthodox Jewish bar mitzvah, followed by a successful enactment, inducting me into Hebraic male adulthood, and then my subsequent theological questions in shul, that's what we call that place, the shul, in shul being answered with repetitive suggestions to just keep engaging in the rituals and reading the texts. Therefore, when the time inevitably arrived that I could no longer escape better accountability for the paramount driving question of what to do about my budding homosexual nature, I decided to turn not to family or theology, but to therapeutic psychology, and seek better understanding there. At the time, I could not have said about this choice anything better than that it intuitively felt most accurate and hopeful to approach my problem from this more modern angle. So one night I asked my mother to arrange psychotherapy for me, as I had a big problem I didn't want to discuss with her, but would with a psychologist. So she set up an appointment for me at the Child Guidance Clinic. And the older woman I met there several weeks later was the very first person I ever came out to as a self-professed homosexual. She was very kind and non-judgmental, and I was placed in a small therapy group with 2 other problematic boys and a nice male psychologist. But the other boys dropped out after a few sessions and the group was closed. So I just decided to keep winging it on my own after that, although I now felt more in touch with and understanding of myself following this first upfront encounter with a psychological approach. For the next several years, I got along adequately enough as a deeply closeted homosexual masturbator, while on the side I read as much as I could about gay love and personality, particularly where I could, at my young age, find psychological discussions. And I decided to myself become a psychologist in pursuit of greater comprehension in this amatory personality area that so intimately consumed me. And then, when I was 17, the most confoundingly catastrophic of possible celebratory events heatedly overcame me, as I found myself, although I had had crushes before, unexpectedly falling in love, romantically, sexually, and totally, for the very first time with someone. Somebody who just happened to be the handsome captain of our high school varsity football team, Harold Rich. Just listen to that name poetically, as it might be spun out allegorically, when so courageously venereally inflamed, the herald of rich tidings, the richness heralding true love, the thrilling homosexual metaphysical harbinger to soaring qualitative wealth beyond all measure compare, the messenger of heaven on earth. To say that in my inexperienced way, I was utterly bowled over by such vastly intimating passion would not have done fair justice to the riveting adolescent revelations that freshly kept marvelously rising up and up, scintillatingly in me. I was transported, transfixed, and appalled. As this extraordinary and consternating wonderment flowed on, I found that I could not continue containing myself perfectly under the consequent surging pressure of remaining otherwise so expressively shut down and isolated. in the protective fashion which I had always been practicing since I first became sexual. So I started an explicit journal of my flourishing secret experiences, and when after some months that in turn grew too much to keep similarly quietly contained, I determined to give the journal to the object of my affections, who was otherwise just a pleasant social friend, which I did out of the blue after a shared social event one Saturday night, only to be confronted by his appalled, yet also caringly concerned reaction when I saw him the following Monday at school. He told me that he had burned my journal to ash in the family barbecue grill. This was the second time I came out to anybody. That move subsequently led to a meeting with the school counselor, who referred me to a prominent neo-Freudian male heterosexual doctor of psychology, who was a professor actually, with whom I thuswise anxiously began therapy in the fall of 1969, in a sincere attempt to altogether convert my despised amorousness. Depressed, alarmed, and confused, I now self-loathingly hungered for a complete heterosexual cure, and held only to the harshest judgment of my gay self, even though my first full experience of erotic, romantic love brought me so transfixedly into such an experientially riveting and ineffably inflating mysterion that I still feel thoroughly and thankfully gripped in its iridescent revelatory influence to this very day. Time. When I was 20 years old, and still quite diligently working towards my seemingly endless cure, I found myself falling in love again, now with a friendly college buddy. And even though this passion too went unrequited, an unanticipated shift in basic attitude came over me that opened up a fathomfully new and revolutionary insight. Homosexual romantic love was actually a very good, special experience, not necessarily in any way morally wrong or spiritually bad. When my concerned therapist then only responded with indignant hostility and caring condemnation to my subsequent attempts at thoughtfully exploring what was for me a startlingly refreshing position, I soon decided to quit that therapy as now ethically bankrupt, and instead start learning to authentically accept my actual errors and my resultant identity. I consequently, step by step, came out publicly as a gay man, and in 1972 joined with some initial trepidation in the then emerging post-Stonewall gay liberation movement, soon enough wholeheartedly embracing its, to me, now wonderful emancipatory concepts and ideals. I there so became a proud and committed gay activist. Still intellectually and existentially interested in better understanding my meaningful same-sex loving origins in psychology, I would get into intense conversations with myself and others about the possible source and purpose of who we were as gay. Most of my new friends and associates, an understandably aversive reaction to homophobic oppression against gay people, were for the most part quite leery of even considering mental causes for subjective reasons. But having broken from the sickness model, I now hungered for more explicative illumination about my worthy homosexual self. As yet, though, I found little in the way of thoughtful literature or others' ideas that went very far past conceptual slogans like "gay is good," or being contributive gay versions of counterculture hippies or political radicals. I too had now become such a contemporary version, and this did indeed feel nurturingly inspiring and purposively fulfilling to an increasingly rewarding degree congruently light years past my prior self-denying existence. Yet at the same time, my fundamental homosexuality itself, in its deeper potential comprehension for me as a valuationally evolving person, still discordantly remained only a great big mystery. It did more integratively amount now to that central erotic and romantic fact which I eagerly stood fully behind, but for the most part all this was simply heterogeneously combined with the various other ideas, beliefs, and interests I, along with my fellow activists, experienced and followed. It was in this fermenting context during my 21st year that I met Don Clark, the first openly declared gay psychologist, who sharply consolidated insights into a newly respectful apprehension of thematic homosexual personality I exhilaratingly found instantly galvanic. And from that initial encounter, I avidly became his student.